Thank you for listening to Soho Bites, the only podcast in the world, as far as we're aware, dedicated to talking about films set in Soho, the beating heart of bohemian cosmopolitan London. If you would like to support the show, you can do this in the form of a star rating or review at sohobitespodcast.com/review, or if you'd like to put a small amount of money where your mouth is, you can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Donations can be from as little as £3, which will buy, at London prices, about half a drink for one of our thirsty guests. You may hear some different URLs in the upcoming episode, but by far the easiest way is to follow one of those links. They are again sohobitespodcast.com/review and sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Thank you for your continued support and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Soho Bites. Soho Bites is the podcast in which we talk to people who love Soho and people who love film. My name is Dominic Delaghi, and it's nice to hear that groovy theme tune once more. You may have noticed we've been away for a couple of months. This was so we could concentrate on our new podcast, Kino Quickies. This is a show based around live screenings of 1930s quota quickie films at the Kino Cinema in Bermondsey Square, South East London. We really enjoyed making the show, and I would encourage you to check it out at kinoquickies.com. But the theme music, I'm afraid, is just not as groovy as this one. Here's a little burst of it. See what I mean? That's much better. We will be returning to the Kino for another season of screenings and podcasts in the autumn. Please do come. But in the meantime, it's very nice to be back in the pre-gentrified mean streets of old Soho. Talking of Soho, and why would I not be, the film we're talking about in this episode is It Happened in Soho from 1948. Directed by the mysterious Frank Chisnall and made apparently on a shoestring budget of ration stamps and bottle tops, this flimsy film screams post-war austerity, but despite that, it boasts quite a major star. Heading up the cast is Richard Stinker Murdoch, who in 1948 was one of the biggest names on British radio. He'd come to prominence in the late 1930s as Arthur Askey's sidekick in the BBC's hugely popular comedy variety show Bandwagon, and at the time It Happened in Soho was released, he was enjoying success in his second big radio hit, Much Binding in the Marsh. To talk about It Happened in Soho, I roped in stand-up comedian, podcaster and broadcasting historian Paul Carenza. You can hear my conversation with Paul in the second half of the show, and before that, in keeping with the theme of BBC radio comedies from days gone by, I met up with the radio comedy writer Mark Brissenden to talk about the Paris Studios on Lower Regent Street. The Paris, as it was called, closed down in 1995, but for nearly 50 years, virtually every BBC comedy you can think of was made there. Mark had the pleasure and honour of working there in the final decade or so of that much-loved venue's existence.
Button up your overcoat when the wind is free. Take good care of yourself, you belong to me. Take an apple every day.
As a Soho Bites listener, you are by very definition a With It het cat, so you will know that this tight vocal harmony group is the Fraser Hayes Four, the singing group who provided the musical interludes for two popular radio comedies of the 1960s, Beyond Our Ken and Round the Horn, both of which were, of course, recorded at the Paris Studios. Other shows recorded there over the years included I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Goon Show, The Navy Lark, Weekending, The News Headlines, Just a Minute, and my particular favourite, Take It From Here, which launched the career of the absolutely fabulous June Whitfield.
Oh, wrong.
And it wasn't just comedy. The Paris was home to all sorts of entertainment shows, dramas, readings, discussions, live bands, including the Beatles, Bowie and the Bonzos, and of course the fabtastic Radio 1 Club had its London branch there from 1968 to 1973.
Yes, it's Radio 1 Club.
And the beat goes on.
Happening live from now till 2.
And then in 1995, the Paris studios closed down. And if you were to walk down Lower Regent Street today, as I did earlier this week, you wouldn't even know it had been there. There's not even a plaque. One person who was very familiar with the smoky bowels of the Paris is Mark Brissenden, who began working there as a jobbing comedy writer in the early 1980s. Mark was on Soho Bites back in episode 24 when we discussed the film Something in the City, and I know him to be a bit of a comedy geek. We arranged to meet up outside the building in which I thought the Paris was located. Wikipedia tells me it was number 12 Lower Regent Street, but that didn't look right somehow when I got there. Not for the first time. I was confused.
Take care of yourself. You belong to me.
I am outside the strict borders of Soho in Lower Regent Street. Well, I thought it was called Lower Regent Street. It now seems to be called Regent Street St James, which is a bit weird. Is that a new thing?
No, God.
I'm taking the Lord's name in vain. There is Mark Brissenden. He's the guest for today.
I was just going to say, because I've only just noticed that, and I've always called it Lower Regent Street.
I think it always was called Lower Regent Street. Well, anyway, we're definitely not in Soho. We are in St James, to be fair, and it's very posh. And we're outside Rex House, which is now a pure gym. But we're here because it wasn't always a pure gym. Mark Brissenden, tell me why we're here. Are you here to sign me up for some what's it?
I'm just waiting for a bypasser to come and do a survey with us or something. Right. That's what. But no, well, because the pure gym now is it used to be the Paris studios at BBC, where we used to record an awful lot of BBC light entertainment comedy programmes. From post-war till the mid-1990s. I was personally involved with the news headlines and weekending and Flywheel Shyster and Flywheel and other things that we recorded down there. I mean, any name that you want to mention in the history of British comedy, past, present and future, will have worked down there up until 1995.
And then in 1995, it was brutally shut down.
I think the BBC just lost the lease, frankly.
Okay.
It was one of those things where they didn't decide because they lost. I believe they lost the lease, and so they moved up to Broadcasting House, which was sort of in the earliest days of its regeneration and this, spaceship that you see today.
Okay, well let's. It's a bit noisy here, and people keep bumping into us. So let's wander. Right. Oh my God. Let's wander off to the pub.
If you see any old photos there's a movie called The 20 Questions Murder Mystery, which is a film set around the long-running TV series 20 Questions. There is an establishing stock shot of the Paris studios there with the queue standing around, and they used to queue round the corner into Carlton Street.
Right, which is where we are now.
And here, this grilling here, this was effectively the back door of the Paris. It had a kind of goods lift. There was no any sort of disability awareness about the place. It was just down a very steep flight of stairs when you got in there, and so if people did come in, occasionally people did come in wheelchairs and stuff, there was a kind of a goods lift to take them down. And now we're walking past this St James Market Pavilion and this curvy building on Norris Street with the Beau Brummel public house, and this is where the Captain's Cabin used to be, which was the official pub of the Paris, basically. And there was a nice little Italian restaurant as well, I think Gianelli's or something like that. This is part of the complete redevelopment of the area.
Because it was a slum before, wasn't it? And wasn't there a stock pot here?
There was a stock pot there. Oh. There were two. There was a stock pot, and I think it was a
West
End kitchen over there, yeah.
Welcome to Two Old Men Reminiscing about buildings that have gone. Okay, let's switch off while we're going to the pub and we'll settle in. Here we go.
This is London, the heart of London. Piccadilly Circus, with Eros shooting his arrow through the swirling traffic of Regent Street, past the shops and the cinemas with their waiting queues. And here is a queue waiting outside a cinema which never shows a film. For this is the home of many of the nation's most popular broadcasts, the Paris cinema of the BBC.
So we've come to somewhere that's slightly quieter now, thankfully, so we can talk in a civilised way. So before we started recording earlier on, you were talking about the history of the Paris studios and how it became a BBC building. Could you go through that?
It's interesting because I know that the government acquired it in '39, obviously when the war broke out for recording, but it didn't become a BBC building until 1946, straight after the war. And previously it had been a cinema. The Paris Cinema was what it was opened as, and it acquired the name of the Paris Cinema simply because it showed French movies. So it was, already set up to record. Obviously, if you've never been there, it's a basement cinema, and this was a basement recording studios. So it was safer from the Blitz. And I went to a show that they called Farewell to the Paris, which was when they closed down the Paris studios in 1995, and they had a huge cast of people who'd worked there from that era to that. And I do remember Maurice Denham, who was in Itmar, one of the original cast members there, and Molly Weir.
It's that man again.
Yeah,
that's a famous wartime comedy. Yeah.
And Molly Weir, who was has been loads of modern audiences would know her as the Flash lady, or from Rent-A-Ghost. But also she was
Something
also,
in the City.
Yeah, and there again, she turns up here again because she was also a maid in a famous sitcom called Life with the Lions.
Was that recorded at Paris?
Yeah, and I recall them talking about wartime recordings down them, literally with the piano player sitting down with a tin hat on and actually sitting under the piano with his hands up. But it really came into its own, in post-war when the BBC took it over and they started to do Much Binding in the Marsh again with our star Richard Murdoch.
Yeah, so that was his. Well, he starts off with Bandwagon, and he's quite famous for Men for the Ministry. But Much Binding in the Marsh was his big hit, wasn't it?
Because it was with Kenneth Horne as well, and they both met in the Air Force during the war.
And Much Binding in the Marsh.
I must say, I'm glad that this is over.
At Much Binding in the Marsh. If only we could rest, we'd be in clover.
I tell you what, let's make the others come here and rehearse.
I only hope the whole thing doesn't go from bad to worse.
So, Costa,
Yes, sir.
Dudley,
Sir.
let's have the second verse.
At Much Binding in the Marsh. At Much.
And that was the great thing about the Paris, because then obviously that led on all to things like Educated Archie and Hancock, and the Goons came down there. I mean, if you want to see it, probably because they recorded the last Goon show ever down there, and so that's actually recorded, a TV recording of the Paris studios, so you can actually see it.
At Much Binding in the Marsh. At last the two of us can now get started.
I think I'll catch the bus and go to Spagthorpe for a show.
But Mr. Horn and Mr. Murdoch mightn't let you go.
I'd like to see them stop me.
Not that.
Yes, sir, can I?
Now at Much Binding in the Marsh. At Much Binding in the Marsh.
It's comforting that clothes are off the ration. Tiddlim-pom-pom.
At Much Binding in the Marsh. We'll now be dressed up in the latest fashion.
Miss Risco's gone to Blackett's stores to go through all their stock.
The fur-lined trousers I have bought will give you quite a shock.
I'm going to cast all care aside and buy a second sock.
At Much Binding in the Marsh, last verse at Much.
So what show did you work on there?
Well, I worked on quite a few. I mean, the first one I worked on was Weekending, and I was writing sketches for that. I also worked on a show called The News Headlines, which was Radio 2's topical comedy show of the day, featuring, curiously enough, Roy Hudd, and also had June Whitfield and Chris Emmett with the cast. There were a lot of other things, there were pilots and one-off things. Obviously, they did everything down there. The news quiz was down there. They had a fantastic atmosphere down there, and it had a full-time crew down there who were the in-house team of sound recorders, studio managers. So they were there the whole time, and all sorts of shows came in. But he used to have a little kind of hatch-in-the-wall type cafe where, Lulu would dispense toasted cheese sandwiches and cups of
Lulu?
tea. I think that's, isn't it? I think it was. And,
Did she give you a sandwich and go, where?
no, but
A different Lulu, maybe.
See, this is how the thing happens. The BBC I caught sort of the end of in the early 80s still had the kind of tea trolley in the afternoon type thing. It was, we were using manual typewriters still.
At Much Binding in the Marsh. We are out to help restock the country's larder.
The vicar's nimble fingers now some extra tasks have found.
For seizing opportunities, he's always been renowned.
He sits and dances bed socks while the place is going round.
At much riding in the marsh. How'd you get there? Much riding in the marsh.
Good old gooseberries.
At
The lovely thing about the Paris was it was because of all these other shows that had been recorded done, from Lagoons onwards. And if you're most of the people that worked in comedy and liked it were huge comedy buffs, Milligan and Lagoons and people like that were our gods, if you like, and Hancock and all that. And you could feel their presence there. There was a vibe, there's a lovely to be in the same space.
And some of them were because you worked with June Whitfield, he said.
Well, this is it.
And she was an original.
I have to admit, my first ever gag thing, first thing I ever got broadcast to was performed by June Whitfield at the news headlines. And I thought, she's from the Blood Donor sketch.
Amazing.
The Hancock, yeah. But you could sort of walk, because they had photographs, of course, of the greats on the walls and stuff, like you walk around. But you felt as if you were walking in the footsteps of these.
Did you ever want to grab these people and say, what was it like back in the olden days? I'm doing to you now, in fact.
Sort of. But I never I was trying to think, because I met Milligan once. We was doing this show called Flywheel, Charleston Flywheel, like I mentioned, and he was a big, huge Marx Brothers fan. He loved Groucho Marx. And when a friend of mine, Michael Poynton, was doing a documentary about the Goons, and he went down to interview Spike. And curiously enough, the producer, Stuck Mags, the producer of Flywheel, was the same guy. And they recorded, and Spike just wanted to know, he wanted to work with the Marx Brothers before he died. And so he asked if he could be in Flywheel, Shyster and Flywheel. So he, obviously,
You found him a little part.
Found him a little part. He was okay, But no. And but he was quite something. He was a little. I wanted to sort of chat to him more, but he just wanted to come in and do that sort of job and stuff like that. So could be a little fractious, could Spike. What more can he sometimes sort of say? But he was fantastic in the performance. And apart from an interview he gave on the Farewell to the Paris show, that was the last time he was at the Paris studios. That was the last proper recorded comedy show he was in.
My thanks to Mark Brissenden for coming on the show again and for sharing his memories of the Paris studios. When we met up, he actually brought along a couple of pictures, including a running order for Farewell to the Paris, the gala show that closed the Paris back in 1995, and I've put those on the show notes for this episode. That's episode 34. You can see those pictures, along with some other info about Mark and the Paris, at the usual place, sohobitespodcast.com. Hello, this is what's known as a mid-roll ad. It's one of those annoying interruptions that's inserted retrospectively at just the wrong point. And the reason for it is that Soho Bites takes up hours of time every month, and I'm hoping you might be able to support the show. There are two ways you can do this. One is for free, and it's to leave the show a star rating or kind review. You can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/review. Or if you'd like to assist financially to help cover our costs, you can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Thank you very much. Apologies for the interruption, and back to the episode. There's a well-known phrase with which I'm sure you're familiar: all mouth and no trousers, which basically means promising a lot, then failing to deliver the goods. I don't want to be mean to 1948's It Happened in Soho, because I sort of quite like it a bit in a way. But I can't help feeling that by including the word Soho in the title, they're attempting to ascribe to it an edginess and a risque appeal that it just doesn't have. The film pays a lot of lip service to the reputation of Soho as a place of crime, prostitution, artists, drinkers, immigrants, spivs, lost souls, itinerants and political radicals, and it presents Soho as a kind of hinterland that, once entered, is difficult to leave, but we hardly ever actually see any of it. All these characteristics of the area are just talked about or alluded to. It's a textbook case of tell not show. Most of the action takes place inside Angelo's, an all-night Italian cafe with those classic check tablecloths and bentwood chairs. The film starts, though, with some nighttime footage of real Soho, taken from a moving vehicle, or at least I assume it's Soho, because that's what it says on the tin, but it's so dark, all we can actually see is blobs of light jiggling around on a black screen. And then...
Help! Police! Murder!
A desperate woman screams from an upstairs window into the street below. What's required now is a swift, robust, efficient response from a dynamic, proactive police force.
Yes. Go to 50 Lavelle Street, Soho area. A woman reported murdered. Yes, that's right. Okay. Hello. Casualty section? Send an ambulance immediately to 50 Lavelle Street. Yes. Quick as you like. Emergency call.
Well, it's good to know the Met's finest are on the case. Should be wrapped up in no time. Somebody who is on the case is Bill Scott. He's not an officer of the law, though. He's a muckraking journalist whose beat is Soho. He's played by the star of the film, Richard Murdoch.
Scott, where the devil have you been? Now listen, I've just had a tip that a girl's been strangled in Soho. Try and get a picture. Remember, we've got 2 million readers and they're all morbid. By the way, was she pretty?
She was an absolute smasher. Oh, yes, there are stacks of photographs. The bedroom was tastefully papered with pin-ups. Oh, we'll have an exclusive, all right. I swiped the best one. She was lying on the beach with just a suggestion of bathing costume. Don't forget that while you're sleeping peacefully at your desk, I shall be haunting the scene of the crime. Goodbye.
We're now introduced to the wider cast of characters. Firstly, we meet Angelo, the wise, all-seeing, all-knowing cafe owner, played by Paul Demel. He invites Bill and us to look at the faces of his customers. All of them, he says, are respectable people, although we're clearly supposed to imagine that they're anything but. The camera travels from face to face, and each one looks as though they've been found on the central casting website using the filter #dodgy. And then into these surroundings that we're supposed to imagine are very seedy but aren't, walks Susan Marsh, played by Patricia Rain, who is immediately befriended by Bill. She seems much too nice and respectable to be here in nasty old Soho. So what's going on?
I'm awfully sorry, but, well, this is my first visit to Soho, and, you know, it's rather...
Yes, it is rather, isn't it? Tonight of all nights, especially.
You see, the thing was, I was taken to a reunion party, and it wasn't a great success, and one of the boys said that we'd go to a club. It was rather a sordid sort of club, and he got a bit nasty when I wouldn't stay.
Oh, that wasn't nice of him, was it? I hope you managed to catch him a glancing blow with the bar stool on the way out.
Well, I'd like to. But tell me, why did you say tonight of all nights?
Oh, a girl was strangled a few hours ago, about 3 streets away. Nasty business.
Innocent, naive, and a stranger to the goings-on of Soho, Susan becomes chummy with 3 more Soho types. There's the wily old copper, Inspector Carp, played by Henry Oscar. He's of the give them a clip around the ear and send them on their way school of policing. Then there's Paul Sayers, played by John Bailey. He was a medical student, but packed it all in once Soho got his claws into him, to live the life of a penniless artist sitting around in Soho sketching people. And finally there's Julie, a weary and bitter yet beautiful prostitute, played by the only other biggish name in the film, Eunice Gayson, who a few years later went on to star in the first 2 Bond films.
If you'll take my advice, you'll not only get out of Soho, but you'll stay out.
What?
Just the advice an older sister would give you, if you had one.
Yes, but I'm older than you, surely.
Age isn't everything. I've seen what hanging around Soho does to people. Look at me. Or look at Sayers.
Sayers? What's wrong with him?
Nothing much. Just that he's lost any ambition he ever had, and turned into a sponger who hides his self-pity by pretending to be superior.
Yes, but what about Bill Scott? Soho hasn't hurt him.
You don't meet men like him every day. I should know. I've met plenty who were different.
Yes, but if you hate it so much, why don't you get out?
I will one day. Soho's beaten a lot of people, but it's not going to beat me.
So there's been a murder, another murder happens, another murder nearly happens, the goodies beat the baddies, and it's all done and dusted in well under an hour. 52 minutes long the film is. I did attempt to do some research into the director of It Happened in Soho, Frank Chisnell, but he proved to be very elusive. He set up a production company called Frank Chisnell Productions, but only really directed 4 films, none of which made much of an impression, and the bulk of his career was spent working for Movie Tone News. There's actually a documentary-style montage sequence in the middle of the film in which Bill and Susan go out and about, exploring the pubs of Soho, and it has the feel of a Movie Tone or British Pathé short about Soho nightlife. It's the only bit of the film that has any vitality, and it appears that Frank Chisnell was a lot more comfortable working in this style. As I mentioned earlier, Richard Stinker Murdoch, we'll get to that nickname later, would have been known to audiences at the time from his radio appearances, and I think I spotted a knowing nod to this when Bill called Angelo a silly little cafe owner. I think this is a reference to his character in Bandwagon, who would sometimes call Arthur Askey a silly little man. But maybe I'm trying to read too much into it. I do feel like I'm casting around for anything to say about this film. It's actually quite hard to find a lot to say because it's just so insubstantial. I was therefore a bit concerned when I first approached my guest that we might run out of things to say about the film. That guest is Paul Carenza, who, as well as being a stand-up comedian and a comedy writer, is also the creator of the epic British Broadcasting Century podcast. This monster of a podcast is covering the 100-year history of broadcasting in the UK in granular detail. So granular, in fact, that when I last checked, the show was approaching its 50th episode and was still only in the early 1920s. It will be many, many episodes before it reaches the 1930s and 40s heyday of Richard Murdoch, but who better to talk to about a film starring one of the first national radio stars than this radio obsessive? Paul lives out in Guildford and spends much of his time away on tour, so we met online, me under my daughter's bunk bed and he in his shed, to talk about 1948's It Happened in Soho. So here we are. We're here to talk about It Happened in Soho. Not much happens in Soho in the film. But before we get into the film, could you tell me a little bit about your podcast? It's called the British Broadcasting Century.
It is, yeah. This was my lockdown project. I'm a stand-up comedian by trade, and the gigs went from 3 gigs a week to 3 gigs a year. So I thought I need a hobby, and it turns out I've always been interested in broadcasting history to a degree, but the pandemic was the push I needed to turn this into some kind of pod project. And but the more you delve into these things, I'm sure you find this with the Soho things, that actually the more you delve into it, the more you go, oh, there's a lot we can talk about here. So we've taken 40 episodes to get up to John Reith even joining the BBC, or even the existence of the BBC. So there's loads of the pre-BBC story in there as well. We're taking the long way around.
It's incredibly detailed, isn't it? I mean, you've not even got to Broadcasting House yet, because I think the last one I heard was about the it's called Witton, the place out in Essex.
Writtle. Ironically, Witton, there was a broadcast station at Witton in Birmingham as well, but you probably mean Writtle in Essex,
that's right,
which is
yeah.
the more major sort of broadcasting hub, because that was where the first regular British broadcasts came from, that really helped create a demand for radio, and people going, oh, this broadcasting malarkey could last, and then London sort of took over and didn't let it go, and still hasn't let it go, really, I suppose. But yeah, Writtle was what was lovely about that is it was middle of nowhere. It's a village green, and you've just got these guys in a hut who could do the whole Bletchley Park thing of just creating and being geniuses, but away from the prying eyes of the more authoritative HQs of London and things like that. So yeah, the experimental and crazy broadcasts of Writtle were, I think, fascinating.
Yeah. And the reason I asked you specifically to do this film is because, well, it's quite a thin, flimsy film. I think you probably agree with me on that. However, the star of the film is Richard Murdoch, Richard Stinker Murdoch, as he was called. And he's a very significant person, isn't he, in early BBC history? Even though you're nowhere near that in your podcast, you're still back another 5 years till you get to Richard Murdoch.
Oh, at least. A long way. Yeah, I mean, you said we're not even at Broadcasting House yet. We're not even at Savoy Hill yet. We're at the minute, 45 episodes in or something. We're at Magnet House, which was this one-room BBC, like an Amish schoolhouse, which they occupied for the first few months. But it will be years yet before we get to Richard Stinker Murdoch, who was part of a very, very popular and successful. And if you chat to people of the right vintage, they will know all about Bandwagon, which was this classic BBC comedy show, which really sort of paved the way, I guess, for everything from the Goons, even Morecambe and Wise, because it really had a comic double act at its heart, Bandwagon. And it's Arthur Askey, which many people might be a name people might be familiar with, even if it's from the Paul Whitehouse spoof of him on the Fast Show with "Where's your washboard?" and all that sort of thing. Daniel, Arthur Askey, and Richard Stinker Murdoch, who was sort of almost the straight man to Arthur Askey, but actually was, was funnier than many of the funny men of many double acts to come. So, and I mentioned this to my next door neighbour. I said, "Oh, I've been listening to a bit of Bandwagon today." And she started straight away, "Oh, Bandwagon."
Yeah, people do know about it, don't they? And there's not many recordings left of it, is there? I mean, I've heard a few, but I'm the kind of person who would look into that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. They're out there if you find them, but they're surprisingly only 3 seasons were made of Bandwagon, 1938 to 1940, and I guess part of that is the Second World War comes along, but also other shows come along as well. And Arthur Askey and Stinker, Richard Stinker Murdoch did that, and they did a film as well. But in the meantime, Richard Murdoch he joined the RAF. He fought in the war, and then did some acting after the war as well, including this fine film.
Yes, so by the time It Happened in Soho came along, he was he was in the middle of Much Binding in the Marsh, wasn't he? Which was his next big series. So he was a major star, relatively speaking, in the UK. It's odd that he's attached to such a kind of lightweight project with, I've forgotten the name of the director now. What's his name?
Hang on,
Frank Chisnell.
Right. He's a forgettable director. I think it's fair to say.
He's definitely a forgettable director, and he only directed 4 films, as far as I can gather. It seems odd that he managed to get such a big star for such a kind of nothing of a film. Does that strike you as strange?
I can only imagine that he managed to get him because it was made clearly in about an afternoon and for about £5. And it's not too long after the era where you get films where they would just crack through them. I was looking up recently I had to do an article about Cecil B. DeMille, and you look back in the 1920s and 30s, and they'd make hundreds of films a year. And this one, It Happened in Soho, is in fact I don't even know it even qualifies as feature length under modern day rules, because it's sort of under an hour really. I wonder if they could do it by that, and it's clearly filmed in a couple of studio sets with the occasional on location look into Soho itself, which we can talk about that shortly. But yeah, and I just wonder if someone like Richard Murdoch is available, and it's in London. And he does mostly radio things, which are you can record a lot quicker. So yeah, it's doable. I think it's not within the realms of possibility that, of course, he just is available and gets it. And this the director as well, Frank Chisnell, as you said, he's made 4 films. None of them particularly notable, and I think it's experimental. And I'll stand up for him briefly. You've got to love a trier, and he's had the resources. He's made a few films. None of them have lasted. None of them are particularly solid. Bigger budgets came in presumably after, but fair play. You can put some stuff on celluloid, and we're still talking about it today for some reason.
Yeah, and he made his own production company. He had Frank Chisnell Productions. His career before filmmaking or film directing was working for Movie Tone News.
Oh yes,
and that kind of show. There's a sequence in the film where he says to Susan, "Let me show you Soho. We'll look at Soho. You look at Soho, and I'll observe your reaction to it and write about it for my newspaper." And they just kind of there's like a montage sequence when they go around Soho, which is quite interesting in a way. That bit, but they just seem to be kind of standing at the sidelines, pointing at people like, "Oh, look, like they're in a zoo or something." It's very, very odd.
Yeah, you don't feel like you've fully experienced Soho nightlife. They talk about it a bit, and there's the odd sort of pointing off screen, like over there. Oh, it's vagabonds and prostitutes and crime is rife, and it's all sort of talked about in that sort of tone. And the brief glimpses we do get of Soho, which are mostly filmed by putting a camera in front of a car or top of a double-decker bus, whatever, at about 11 o'clock at night, and you can't see it. Like, you've got to squint to go, I think that's a street. I'm not entirely sure. With the classic thing of showing you street names, and you go, "Oh, Old Compton Street," But the trouble is, you look at the sign and go, "Oh yeah, that looks just like it does now," because all they've shown me is the sign Old Compton Street, and the sign hasn't changed much. So there's not a great glimpse of it. But when we got to see the inside of the Dog and Duck pub, for example, whether it was a set or whatever, there's a little immersive moment for for a beat there of what a 1940s London Soho pub was like. So that was quite.
Although
nice.
actually, I think that when they show the outside of the Dog and Duck and then they show the inside of the pub, but I think that is actually the French house, or as would have been the York Minster, because the landlord is Gaston Belmont, who was the very famous Belgian landlord of the French house. And it's either him or it's somebody doing an impression of him, because I suppose he could be representing a type. But yeah, that's a bit odd. And then there's one scene where they're showing these kind of little shots of spivs and artists and foreign people, the sort of people who make up the milieu. I hate that word. I'm going to say it again, though. The milieu of Soho. And there's a guy, a black guy, who has those kind of tribal scars on his cheeks. You kind of see what he's trying to do, but none of it really comes off, you know.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work. I mean, you know, the whole film doesn't really work as a film or as a much of an insight, I suppose. But there is the little hints there. You know, it's I suppose shining a bit of a light on Soho of the day and you know bits and parts of London of the day as well. And it does slightly tiptoe down the road of saying, hey, multicultural London and that sort of thing, even though major multicultural London was yet to come, of course, you know. But it's pre-Windrush, it's just after the Second World War, but it is a slightly different sort of London than you maybe see in other films of the day. The films I have seen from this sort of era are a little bit more upper class, gentrified, and you know, Powell and Pressburger sort of bigger budget. Certainly, I mean, every film in the world, I think, has a bigger budget than this one. So there is that. So with what they've done, it feels like a filmed drama lesson, I suppose, more than anything. And it does give a little vague insight into those sorts of things. They've given it a go to shine a bit of a light on different ethnic cultures and things to a very, very small degree. You got the owner of the cafe, and you know, that sort of thing. There's that.
Yeah, he's sort of and he's supposed to be Italian, but I don't know what that accent is supposed to be. It's generic foreign, isn't it?
It is rather, but you know, it's Italianish. It reminded me of the whole the pub, the Dog and Duck pub, and all that reminded me of Goodnight Sweetheart, the Nicholas Lyndhurst time travel sitcom.
Yeah,
a little of that slight sense of you know, 1940s London to a degree, but yeah.
What do you think of Richard Murdoch? Do you like him?
Yeah, I think he's a solid enough actor, and clearly, I mean, he's from a comedy acting background, and he had more comedy to come, as you said, Much Binding in the Marsh, and even I didn't realise this, he was in Blackadder as well.
Yes, and this is where I introduced my preloaded audio clip of him saying his line in Blackadder. Here we go. Hope you can hear this.
I too have heard such tales. In Harrogate it rained phlegm. And they do say that in Edinburgh the graves did open and the ghosts of our ancestors rose up and competed in athletic sports.
And it's kind of, you can hear his voice, you know. He always had a slight slur to his voice. When he's in Men from the Ministry, which is I know him from really originally, he always sounded slightly like he's just had a heavy lunch. He had a slightly kind of slur to his voice. But I really like him. Generally, he hasn't this sort of affability that means he gets away with not being an Olivier or a.
Well, I love these actors that these not just actors, but these people who span different eras, and he's gone from the 30s with Arthur Askey, Kenneth Horne with Much Binding in the Marsh. You know, of course, Kenneth Horne went on to do Round the Horn. Men from the Ministry, as you say, 60s and 70s. He did a panel show as well in the 60s and 70s. You know, all the way through, really, you know, to then some kids shows, Mr. Majika, which I used to watch growing up as a kid.
Yeah.
And
Did
Rumpole
you do the Moomins?
Bailey.
Yeah, the Rumpole.
Yeah. Never the Twain and Blackadder. So
that's,
you know,
quite
I love
a career,
it.
Isn't it?
That's quite a career. You've got to applaud that, I think.
So we let him off this film.
I think, yeah. I was going to say, you always end up with some stinkers on your CV, and
Yes.
Stinker, of course, would have done.
Do you have any idea why he was called Richard Stinker Murdoch?
I think, from what I gather, it was Arthur Askey who gave him that nickname, and I think it was really just because he had a public school background, and Arthur Askey was like he was the guy who was punching up, you know, as a as performers often did. So it's that whole thing of, those comic strips that used to have those public school nicknames of, Bodge and Pudge and
Pongo Perkins and
Pongo Perkins and all that sort of stuff. So Stinker Murdoch was his way, not that he necessarily stank, but just as a way of saying that, oh yes, you're from that sort of public school toff kind of background, aren't you, Stinker?
Yeah. And Bandwagon, I'm not quite clear about this, but it may be that you've not got this far in your meticulous research yet. It has a status of being the first programme to be at a regular time slot or something, because it was so popular that people would, all these programs that famously cleared all the pubs, like Hancock and whatever, and Bandwagon was the first one to do that, and they needed to schedule it so people knew. Is there truth in that, or is that a kind of urban myth?
Well, I read that. I've heard that as well, said about Bandwagon. It's tricky. I think they sort of have a point, but you can see going back to the very start, things were scheduled. And it took a few months in, literally 1923, we're talking here, for there to be much regularity. It'll be that every night you would hear a concert at the same time at 7 o'clock or at 8 o'clock, whatever it might be. You'd have the news bulletins at a certain time. You'd have children's hour at a certain time. And actually, it took a good year or two, I think, for them to realise that actually not only do people want regularity for things every night, but actually there's a benefit to saying, look, if you like, well, like I was going to say jazz, but Reith famously hated jazz and didn't want it on the BBC. But if you like classical music, if you like opera music, if you like a certain type of music, tune in on a Tuesday for that or a Thursday for that. And it took some time, a year or two, for that to come into place. So it's a long way of saying, I don't know. But also, there was comedy earlier on the BBC, but this was also really the first, I think, of its kind to do comedy in quite this way, which was this really fun, boisterous double act between them. And they did have extra cast members as the series went on to Series 2 and Series 3. But this lovely idea that they both lived in a flat at the top of Broadcasting House as well.
Yeah, with these goats and chickens and things.
Hi there, girl. What are you doing on this roof? Yes, that's right, Stinker. What are we doing on this gentleman's roof?
Well, at the moment, sir, we're preparing breakfast.
Are you responsible for that?
Oh, no, sir, that's not us.
No, you've got the wrong one this time, sir. That's Mrs. Bagwash.
Mrs. Bagwash, who's she?
The woman who comes in to help us with the spring cleaning. Granted.
Who are these people?
Well, I haven't a card, but I'm Big-Hearted Arthur, and this is Stinker Murdoch.
Yes, we came here for an audition, and they sent us up here and told us to stand by.
Yes, and we've been standing by now for 3 months.
Do you mean to say you've been living on this roof for 3 months?
Well, we wanted to be on the spot, sir, and what a spot we're on.
Take all this rubbish and clear out.
Clear out? You mean leave our flat?
At once.
But we've only just bought a new bed thing.
Get out!
But what about our audition?
If you're not done in half an hour, I'll send for the police.
Always me Piscatorio.
Territorial.
Albert Memorial.
Isn't he a bully? Come on, Pete.
There is, as I feared before this conversation began, there's not a lot to say about the film. We've spoken mostly about Richard Murdoch because he is the star and the most interesting, and actually why I asked you to come on, because he's a major radio person, as are you. But I believe you have a million things to say about the film.
No, I've got about 4 things to say about the film.
Oh, 4? Well, that's 4 more than me.
Firstly, well, let's just say, right, okay, all you need to know about the film is what it says in the title. It happened in Soho. That's it. There you go. That's all that happened. Generally, though, what else do you want to say? Terrible acting. Yes, that's in there. But then I'm not judging the actors. I think they had no budget, no time, whatever. But straight in, help, police, murder. The first words you hear, that gives you a little insight into Soho of the day. There's that, and the mix of newspaper editor, police, and then generally a lot of drinking cups of tea in cafes and pubs and things. They just change drinks the whole time. Cup of tea in the cafe. Let's go to the pub. There you go. Let's go on a tour of Soho. And repeat, generally speaking. That's the film.
That policeman at the beginning, he seems to be kind of sitting at his desk with his chin on his hand. The phone rings. Oh, there's been a murder. Yeah, go over to such an address and sort the murder out. He puts the phone down and just puts his chin back on his hand. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it is what it is, isn't it, really? And I should say, I saw it on Talking Pictures, so it may be, for those whose interest is piqued by this and thinks, wow, after this rave review, I can't wait to see what happened in Soho. There's every chance it will be repeated on Talking Pictures quite soon.
I would definitely watch it, though, again. I mean, I've watched it several times. I'm not going to watch it again for a while, but if, I did watch it voluntarily, and I don't regret having watched it because it's quite interesting.
And enjoy the shoddy production values and wobbly sets and all those things. It's sort of, dare I say, it's not good enough to quite pastiche even, but there was 1 or 2 moments where it almost looked like a spoof of itself. He's on the phone at the very end, and he has one of those really short phone calls where he just goes, "Yes? Oh, great, I'll be right there." Hangs up the phone and goes, "Who was it?" "Well, it was my editor. And he says that if I go over to this street, then there's someone over there, and they've been arrested for having broken into a building society, and his wife has run off with a builder, and they've gone and emigrated to the West Indies, and whatever it is, I've made that up completely. But like, there's no way that all of that information was conveyed in a half-second phone call, you know. And so there were moments that felt a bit like Naked Gun or Airplane or whatever that sort of thing is, you know. But that's fun.
So are you pleased that I asked you to watch it?
I am glad I watched it. So yes, thank you for sending me. I put it this way: there is absolutely no way on earth I would have watched it otherwise.
No, that's true. Yeah.
There's that.
So if people wanted to perhaps see you live in the flesh performing on a stage somewhere, where and when might they do that?
PaulCarenza.com and click on Gig Guide, and you can see I'm all over the place. In fact, most of this year I'm doing some stand-up, but more so really I'm on tour doing a recreation of the very first BBC broadcast. So if you want to see how the BBC began, the show's called The First Broadcast, The Battle for the Beeb in 1922. And yes, I'm all over the land between now and November, which is the centenary of the BBC. And that will be my last show. And that is in London. It's not quite Soho. That will be at the Museum of Comedy, which is sort of near Tottenham Court Road. So we're just east of Soho.
Yeah, didn't you? That sounds like the title of a film, East of Soho. In fact, I think it might be.
West of Java, east of Soho.
Yeah. Haven't you done a gig there already in this tour?
I did.
I missed, because I wanted to go, but I totally missed it.
Yeah, well, most people did miss it, it turns out, so I thought I'd go back in the hope of...
Oh, right.
No, we had a
That's
good few.
considerate.
Yeah, so I did Museum of Comedy a few months ago, but when they offered me a show there, I thought it would be nice to also do one. I want to do a show in somewhere special on the centenary night, November 14th. 2022 will be the 100th anniversary of the BBC, so I thought, let's go back.
So a date for your diary there, November the 14th, Museum of Comedy, the first broadcast. Details are all on paulcarenza.com, and I'll post as many links as I can think of, including one to the full film, because at the time of recording it's available to watch on TPTV Encore. You'll find all of that on the show notes at sohobitespodcast.com. Many, many thanks to you, Paul Carenza, for coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing you in person at the Museum of Comedy in November. Remember, dear listener, if you want to get in touch with the show to comment, berate or make suggestions, you can do so on Twitter, on @BitesSoho, or by email on sohobitespodcast@gmail.com. And if you are so inclined, you can leave us a nice review at ratethispodcast.com/SohoBites. That's ratethispodcast.com/SohoBites, and that would be very much appreciated. Soho Bites is produced by me, Dom DeLargy, and is based on an original idea by Dr. Jing-Un Young. We'll be back next month with another conversation about a film set in Soho. That's all from me. Bye for now.